Hello there. Today's theme is command and leadership in the Roman army. And this is based on a few talks I've given over the last, 20 years or so, I suspect, in various places in slightly different forms and in more than one case to military personnel, army officers in the British Army, trying to give them a sense of how their experience might relate to the Roman army, but also what are the uses of looking back at another institution, another military force in the past. How might that help you understand how things work today, not necessarily within your own system, but when you come to look at others, and generally help within military education. So that was part of the purpose, but it was also trying to show how we go about looking at anything from the ancient world, particularly an institution like the Roman army. So giving them an idea to people who were intelligent, often educated, usually had degrees of one sort or another. There are a fair few historians usually dotted around in the audience, and also military people who've lived within one of these institutions, and then trying to say, well, this is how we understand the Roman army. This is how we go about it. These are the methods. So be careful about jumping to conclusions quickly unless you follow the right approach to using the sources. So the sources for the ancient world will be familiar to a lot of the people here, and some of what we'll cover today will actually go over other ground that I've talked about, usually in more detail in other talks. So we'll talk a little bit about careers, structures within the Roman army for the various officer ranks, this sort of thing. I'm including them again today for the sake of completeness, really, so that this talk will make sense on its own. And I'm setting myself a challenge, which I will no doubt fail to meet, that this talk should come in at round about the hour, a little bit more, a little bit less, rather than the great extended 2-hour plus rambles that sometimes happen, simply just because I'd like this as something that does have some ideas, some fresh approaches, some insights perhaps to most people, but also is a good, accessible introduction to these sorts of questions, and that anyone who hasn't been to the channel before could watch this video and know what's going on and follow it from the start. So although there will be the occasional mention of, well, I've talked about this elsewhere, I'm going to try and cover everything we need to, but from the point of view of the purpose of today, of trying to understand how the command structure, the officers operated, what they did, who they were, what levels of authority they had, how they interacted with each other, this sort of thing. Now, regular viewers may also have noticed that we've got a different background today. That's thanks to some work being done on trees across the road in front of the house, which is the normal room I use. So this one's a little bit different, but again, I suppose we're on the road, are we? We've gone downstairs. But I think it should work reasonably well. The light may be a little bit harsh. This room is lit with big windows on the south side. Now, we should be all right on this fairly dull day, but it might suddenly become a little bit harsh, and I can see from this that one side of my face is much more shadowed than the other. But again, that's the nature of this channel. It's just me sitting down somewhere and holding forth, so it's not meant to be too slick and too professional, because I don't have the time for that. And anyway, the point is the ideas, the discussion. This should be as close to sitting down somewhere in comfort and having a chat after dinner as I can make it. I can't provide the dinners for everybody, and nor myself, given that I'm doing this in the morning. But anyway, so we're coming to back to command and leadership in the Roman army. We're going to look at it from a practical point of view as far as we can. So how can we take what we get in the ancient sources and try and reconstruct the sort of things that a modern military would understand, even if we're saying, well, this is how you today might solve this problem or deal with this aspect of things. The Romans, from a different society, different culture, obviously different technology as well, might do things differently. So those are the sorts of questions we want to talk about. Now, evidence for the Roman army comes from the literature. We've got famously accounts by people like Caesar. That's marvelous. He was an eyewitness, he was involved, he was the commander writing narratives of his own campaign. That also comes with the pitfalls that he is the commander writing his own story and is bound to be very, very favorable to himself and present a particular perspective, a particular point of view. Other sources were written by people who weren't there, or in the case of Josephus, they were a participant, but on the other side at one point they're more as an observer. The siege of Jerusalem. Others, like Tacitus, were drawing on sources from eyewitnesses, official reports, other earlier histories, all of this sort of thing. we've lost the vast majority of literature from the ancient world. Only a tiny, tiny fraction has survived. So we start off with limited information, and we have to make the best of it, and often admit that there are things that we don't really know, or that we're only guessing, or that if other things had survived, then they might give us a very different slant on what's going on. Archaeologically, you can see the camps, the bases, the lines of fortification, the other structures constructed by the Roman army, occupied by the Roman army, Hadrian's Wall being a prime example, but sometimes I've given this talk when I've been guiding people around Calais and places like that, so there have been these physical remains we've looked at to give them an idea. So there's been part of that context. How does this fit in? But most will understand this is showing us the army when it's not actively operating. You could argue it's a little bit different with some of the frontier systems like the limes in Germany, like Hadrian's Wall, the Antonine Wall. Though even there, the bulk of the time, the soldiers living in those barracks are probably not spending actively campaigning, fighting anybody. There will be long periods where it is comparatively quiet, even if there is a greater potential for the outbreak of violence, the outbreak of warfare in places like that. So a lot of army life is mundane, is routine, is day-to-day, is not about the ultimate purpose of the army, which is to go out and win wars, fight other people. So those physical evidence are very useful. They tell us about structures, organization, lifestyle, the prestige. You can look at the level of accommodation given to officers of different ranks and get some sense of, well, this is how they are viewed by society, by the army, and that may give some clear indication as to just how much leeway, independence, importance they have within the running of the army, whether it's in administration on a day-to-day basis or whether it actively does go off and operate on campaign in the field. So you also have evidence from equipment provided by that, so you can get some idea of what the kit is that they're using, what sort of weaponry, what sort of protective gear, what sort of tools they're using, what are the engineering limitations and abilities possessed by the army at any one time, what's the sort of food they're eating, how is that carried, how is that supplied. Archaeology can give you insight sometimes into many of these things, but again, it doesn't tell you the whole picture. Epigraphy is another big deal for the Roman army in the way that it perhaps wouldn't be for modern armed forces. I mean, there are those wonderfully painted signs for doors in various army bases. We even had them in Yeomanry House, the old Yeomanry House that I think now has been pulled down in Oxford, where the OTC was based, which often gave the rank, the unit of whose office this was, its purpose, all this sort of thing. On wood, of course, written and painted, which would be much less likely to survive. The Romans probably did a lot of that. We certainly know there were signs, the equivalent of inscriptions, painted on wood that very rarely survive. What we tend to get are the pieces of stone inscribed with dedications when a unit or an individual is offering sacrifice, worshipping the gods, emphasizing their loyalty to the emperor. When they've built something, we've restored a gateway, we've built a barrack block, we've built a granary, built a road, tile stamps they put on thing, or individuals telling us about their careers, and that might be ordinary soldiers, it might be middle-ranking or very senior officers, can give us some idea of how they would report, what they would boast about, what they would consider significant. And that allows us to get some sense of what are the typical patterns for careers and what are the exceptional ones. Who are the mavericks who seem to do things rather differently, and what's normal for the man who ends up commanding a legion, a cohort of auxiliaries, a century of legionaries or auxilia. How do they get there? So we have all these different types of information, and they tell us different things, but they don't tell us everything. We don't have traces of the entire world, the real world occupied by the human beings who served in the Roman army and those around them who were impacted by the army's activities, whether it's the families of soldiers, of officers, the friendly civilian communities living near army bases, protected by army bases, the allied and other peoples, the enemies that can be sometimes that are beyond the frontiers, or groups that rebel or whatever, that find themselves feeling the full force of the Roman army. Much of that has gone. We know this was a complex world as ours is. It was full of lots of people. They were bound to have slightly different views, different perspectives on things, different experiences. And the Roman army is around for a long, long time. So although perhaps the pace of technological change is much slower in the ancient world, that doesn't necessarily mean that when you come to attitudes, ideas, songs, jokes, the popular culture that existed, of which we see traces, that's not changing a lot, and it doesn't vary from region to region and time period to time period, so that serving in Legio II Augusta at Caelian in AD 100 might well have many similarities with serving there in AD 200, but isn't necessarily going to be exactly the same. There will be differences. The empire's changed, society's changed, your attitudes have changed, not least because the empire's lasting so long. So in 100 AD, there would still be people around who could remember the conquest of that part of what would become South Wales. By 200, forget all that. That's in the dim and distant past. It's as far away as the First World War is to us now. So it's a little bit like detective work. The old cliche was that the archaeologist, the ancient historian, is the detective trying to piece together all the clues to work out what happened. The difference, the big distinction is that we have an even smaller selection of clues than are conveniently provided for our literary or on-screen detective, but also we are not dealing with a single crime. We're not dealing with one event, one moment where this happened and we're trying to work out, right, this person had this motive and they did A, B, and C. This person did X, Y, and Z. Together, this was the end result. The premise of a lot of detective fiction is very, very simple, because we want a satisfying solution at the end of it, with the feeling that the viewer, the reader, could have worked it out for themselves, and that the dots all do join together when you come and look back at it with hindsight. You've also got to think about all the things that people at the time assumed and knew without having to write down, without ever having to tell anybody. And this is something where, when you talk to anybody within any sort of institution, particularly the military today, they will very readily recognize that there are things that they simply do and that everybody knows, that aren't set out in this is how to be a British soldier, a British Army officer of this rank. Yes, you will go through formal training to do any of these things, to be prepared for any of these tasks, but then you're going to pick up a lot about how the army works, the navy works, whatever it might be. In that particular case, how your particular regiment, your battalion might work. Different ways of doing things. The British are incredibly tribal, the British Army in particular, with its badges, its names, its ways of doing things. But they're there everywhere. And I think I've used this example before. I remember taking a couple of Napoleonic historians, both real experts on the British Army of Wellington's era, and more widely of the era in general, around Caelian and the museum there, and trying to explain, well, we look at this tells us, gives us an idea of a centurion's career, but there are so many assumptions in the person setting up this inscription that we don't know. We've got to guess, and we might well guess wrong. And the interesting thing, I've probably cited this example before, is that they said very quickly there's quite a lot about the British Army of the early 19th century that doesn't seem to be recorded. And every now and again a new source crops up and explains how they did a particular thing. But there's an awful lot about what was normal for the daily routine of a battalion, how much training you did, what sort of training you did in peacetime, how you decided on certain responsibilities, certain tasks, what was considered acceptable, what wasn't, and that might not necessarily be the same as the next one. There's an awful lot that a society and an institution simply knows, and there were plenty of people alive at the time in Regency England who would not have understood that the army always did this particular thing, or the navy did things that way. Those little things are there, they're very important. They are the hardest of all to reconstruct about any society because they are extremely unlikely to leave any trace that we will notice. It might be that it's there. A lot of these things, again, it's simply we see the end result or glimpses of the end result, but we don't really know why. So you've got to be very careful analysing an institution like the Roman army and trying to understand it as a real living, breathing entity that existed for many centuries, that operated and was very successful for that long period, just how it all worked. So, we're going to be mainly looking today at leadership in battle, because obviously that's the most dramatic moment that tends to attract more attention, especially in the literary sources. And the literary sources are best placed to tell us about what was actually done, how things occurred, how the army operated. So let's think a little bit about the context of ancient battles. These, generally speaking, could be substantial in numbers, but were not vast on the scale of the Napoleonic era, let alone the world wars of the 20th century. Weaponry is still fairly basic in terms of technology, and certainly very limited in range. The furthest away you can harm someone will be with some form of artillery, and the range of that is probably 400 or 500 yards at most, and often less. Effective bow range is going to be considerably less. Any thrown missile, javelins, darts, the pilum, this sort of thing, have significantly reduced ranges. And most people are armed with weapons that they're really designed to be used face to face, at a very short distance of a few feet away, a spear, a sword, this sort of thing. So battle is face to face. It is generally clashes of massed formations of troops. There may be skirmishes, there may be dispersed formations as well, but the bulk of any battle line in almost every circumstance comes down to ranks and files, fairly densely formed units of both infantry and cavalry. Armies average between 20 and 30,000. That's pretty big. That's most of a Roman provincial army going off to operate. Many battles would be smaller than that. Very, very few would be larger. The exceptions tend to be when one organized state, the Roman Empire obviously is an organized state, comes up against another that is more or less organized. So obviously battles against the Parthians and Persians could get bigger. Battles against the Dacian kingdom, the operations where you have, under Decebalus in the late 1st, early 2nd centuries AD, a king who has united his people and surrounding peoples to a degree that is rare, and is therefore able to organize, finance, and maintain bigger armies, at least for longish periods within campaigning. Then things can get bigger. When you're fighting against a group of one particular people that are fairly loosely organized on a tribal sort of clan basis, everything's going to be smaller. So a lot depends on the enemy. In many respects, the biggest battles the Romans fight tend to be when they're in civil wars and they fight against other Romans. The civil war question is obviously a big factor at certain periods, particularly from the 3rd century AD onwards, where many Roman troops are going to find this experience they go through at least once, and often more than once during their career. So big battles against fellow Romans who fight just like you, that's a possibility. At other periods, much less so. I mean, it's a sort of hypothetical thing, but it's not common experience. In the 1st century AD, you have the 68-69 civil war. The next big one doesn't come until 193, and the death of Commodus. So for most soldiers then, civil war wasn't a reality. In the late Republic, it had been at certain periods, but that tends to produce bigger battles. When you're dealing with those armies, even the big ones of the 20 to 30,000 mark, then frontage of a battle is probably no more than 2 or 3 miles and might be less. These are not very large operations spreading as a connected battle over wider areas in the way that, you think of the Battle of the Somme or the Battle of Stalingrad or something like that. These huge things, battles tend in the ancient world still to be decided in one day, or very rarely more than one, and fought within a fairly restricted area Doesn't necessarily mean you can see everything that's going on, because it might be fought in marshes, in woodland, very hilly country. There might be other conditions that make visibility more restricted. Nevertheless, it's fairly narrowly contained compared to other periods of history. You know, it's not you don't get the Leipzigs, you do get something more like the Waterloos, but again, not quite as big as that, but concentrated areas. So we're going to be looking at a slightly higher level, and we're going to be looking at the middle-ranking officers, the centurions, then the tribunes, prefects, people like that, and then the legion, the large group commanders, the army commanders, that sort of thing. So we'll try and spread it with all of that and look as far as we can at what each group is doing. You know, again, I've often been speaking to sort of lieutenants, captains, majors, that sort of level, who would fit within the centurionate. They'd be that would be their equivalent in the Roman army. We're going to be looking at them, but we're going to be looking a little bit higher as well, to put them in the context of, well, all right, this is your job, but what's going on around you? Where does that fit into the wider picture? So the evidence also tends to be biased towards the senior officers, the senators in particular, to some extent the equestrian officers, but it's particularly the senatorial tribunes, the legion commanders, the army commanders, you know, the top of Roman society. They're the people who get to write their stories or are written about. They're the ones that tend to interest the audience that starts with them, the literary audience. Let's do a basic run through of the army first, though, because it does help to understand just what we're talking about. And again, you can find other videos that are far more detailed on this already on the channel, and there will be more to come at various stages. But for the sake of completeness, let's go through it. So you have the basic division is between citizens and non-citizens. That's legal, but also a question of status, prestige, this sort of thing. Your Roman citizens by the 1st century AD consist of, 4 million or so adult males at any one time, probably more as time goes on. The group keeps, it doesn't have any particular ethnic attachment to Rome or even Italy by this time. Roman citizenship has been granted widely, and because of the colonization program that occurred in the later 1st century BC into the 1st century AD, lots of Roman former soldiers have been settled down in North Africa, in Gaul, in Spain, in Beirut, the place that gives Beirut its name. That's a Roman colony. There are lots of military colonies, so these men have set up their families, sometimes with wives they've brought out from the empire, sometimes they've married local girls. They've raised children, some of whom will enlist in the Roman army. So you are growing up in a different environment. You've never necessarily seen Italy, but you might still be a Roman citizen. Beyond that, it doesn't make a huge deal of difference. The other half of the army, the non-citizens, the auxilia, for most of the 1st and 2nd centuries, these men, if they're honorably discharged after their 25 years of service, will get Roman citizenship. So that's another way the citizen body grows. And their children might decide to join the citizen legions rather than the auxilia. So there's this distinction, but they're all soldiers. They are all soldiers of Rome, representatives of the Roman Empire. The citizens are organized into legions. You've got other groups like the Praetorian Guard, the urban cohorts, they're based in Rome, but we don't really need to worry about them at all today. The legions are substantial forces with a theoretical paper strength of 5,000, 5,500-ish, that sort of scale. So I suppose a strong brigade by more recent standards. They have 10 cohorts, 9 of them 480 strong, 1 of them 800 strong. And there are, by the end of the 1st century, around about 30 of them. And that, during the 2nd century, that's round about the figure. It sometimes increases to a few more and eventually will increase to about 33, 34, this sort of thing. But some are lost and never reformed through dishonor or disaster, and new ones are raised. But there isn't a vast expansion. There had been 60-odd legions when Augustus was left as the last man standing at the end of the Civil War. He defeated Mark Antony. He decides on 28. The number gradually increases, but fairly gradually. There's an attempt at least to keep to that sort of size, the round about 30, a little bit either side, which seems to be a balance between what we feel the empire can afford in terms of pay, manpower, and also need. This should do the job. The tactical unit is the cohort. As I say, most of these, numbers 2 to 10, are 480 strong. Again, that's their paper strength, their theoretical strength. And again, whenever you talk to people actually in any armed force, they will know that theoretical strength and reality very rarely coincide too exactly. But again, it's amazing how often scholars forget that. The commander of the legion is a legatus legionis. He is a senator who has been appointed by the emperor. The Senate consists of something like 500 to 600 people for most of this period. 500, 600 members. They're all men, obviously. It's the Roman system again. We won't go into more detailed discussion of that. So these are people who are from the elite of imperial society, and yet 26, 27, nearly 30 of them will find themselves going out to command legions at any one time. A couple of the legions, the ones in Egypt and later on some ones posted to the east in the early 3rd century, are commanded by equestrians. Again, look at the other talks about that. We don't need to worry about that too much. But basically, the commander of a legion for this period is a senator. His second in command, probably anyway, his most senior, the most prestigious man in most other respects, certainly in social respects, is a tribune with what was called the broad stripe. It was part of his uniform. He had a broader sort of ribbon sash thing almost around his tunic, around his armor. He is someone who is aspiring to a senatorial career, is most likely to be the son of a senator, from a senatorial family, but much, much younger. We'll look in detail at that in a minute. And you also have the prefect of the camp who's come from a different career path. It's not quite certain whether he would be second in command of the legion if the legate is absent, or whether the tribune would be. Is he third in command? Is he second in command? He's up there. His role is much more administrative, and in terms of he's more likely to be a very experienced former officer rather than a young aristocrat beginning his career like the tribune. So people tend to think, well, surely you'd put that man in charge, but the dynamic may not have quite worked that way. You also have other officers. You've got 5 tribunes from the equestrian order. The equestrian order, or knights, we could translate it as that. That's the social group below the senatorial class. They are wealthy, but there's a lot of them. There are tens of thousands of these men around the empire, and many of them come from provincial communities. They're all Roman citizens, of course. All these officers will be Roman citizens. So we've got the non-citizen auxilia are organized at a lower level. They are organized at the cohort level, effectively. So infantry are in cohorts. The cavalry are in cohort-sized formations that are known as ally, singular ala, or wing. So a cohort is generally around about 480 to 500 strong, but some are officially called 1,000 strong, but actually it seems to mean somewhere between 800 and 1,000, depending on the type and structure. Some of these units, a significant proportion, consist of an infantry cohort with a smallish cavalry contingent, about a quarter the size, attached to them. So very, very useful for garrison duty, patrolling, all this sort of thing. They seem to be the workhorses of the Roman army in many respects. However, they are not organized at any level beyond that. There are no regimental groups, brigade groups. There's nothing equivalent to the 5,000 strong legion structure that has a hierarchy, a commander at the top, staff, all of this sort of thing. Auxilia remain independent units that get attached to provincial armies, so they have that higher level, and at times can be attached to legions to operate, or can be... You get temporary brigades for campaigning purposes. There's no good evidence for a direct brigade, almost divisional structure, where you have, say, this legion and these set auxiliary units are administered by the commander of that legion and his staff, and they're regularly part of the training, the operations, the day-to-day administration of that as a group, and then serve together on campaign. Temporary formations like that do happen on campaign with an officer specifically appointed, but there's not a system whereby, oh, you get to this rank, therefore you command this legion and so many cohorts, so many ally, that sort of thing. They don't seem to have it. The commanders of the auxiliary units are prefects, sometimes tribunes. Again, it varies on the status of the unit, but they are equestrian officers, so they have come through that system. So let's start at the top and look at the senatorial officers who command a legion and provide the most senior of the tribunes. So there are, say, 6 tribunes in every legion, but one of them is an aspiring senator who socially is far more important. And again, this is marked, it comes back to the way the physical remains work. He gets a bigger house in a permanent depot, camp, base, legionary fortress than the equestrian tribunes. Not as big as the senator who's in charge, who has a very large courtyard house, but again, it gives us an idea of their status, how things work. So let's run through the senatorial career system. One important thing, and this, we come back to this again and again, I know I bang on about this a lot, but it is important because so many people don't seem to understand that the Roman system did not divide military careers from political careers, and that senators did both. They had military posts, they had civil posts, political posts. It was all part of the same structure. Now, some people emphasize one aspect more than another, but the idea, you get it again and again in TV and films, that you have the character who's the soldier, oh, I don't understand politics, I've just been with the army all my life, and all this sort of thing. You don't really have those in the Roman system. But their opportunities for the military experience are as follows. So, your senior tribune of a legion, that's when you start. So bear in mind, all this thought that this man might be the second in command or third in command of the legion certainly can end up being at least in nominal charge of very large formations on campaign, and yet this is his first taste of military life in most cases, unless he's gone in formally with a relative and served on campaign with him as a sort of, very, very junior staff officer. So he's usually to be a tribune, late teens, early 20s. Post might last from 1 to about 3 years, perhaps even less, perhaps a few did 6 months. Trajan is supposed to have done more, but how much of that is flattery, we don't know. There is an emphasis, you praise someone by saying they took the post seriously. They didn't just see it as a chance for cutting loose and having loads of parties and living, away from the family's scrutiny and doing what you liked. But others were serious soldiers. They tried to understand how the army worked. They tried to be diligent. They tried to learn. That's what Tacitus says about Agricola. He contrasts him with the sort of wastrels that were doing the post at the same time. And this is why he becomes such a great soldier and such a successful governor of Britain later on. But you jump from being tribune, 18, 19, 20, 21, that sort of age, then you'd next be back in the army with a formal post round about the age of 30 or in the early 30s, when you would become the legatus legionis, the legionary legate commanding the whole legion. Again, the post seems to have lasted 3 to 4 years on average. This is based primarily on inscriptions that give us a sense of how a man's career is developing, what posts he does, and then we can judge from how long or how often somebody appears in a particular post, which means that the evidence is a bit sketchy. Most of these estimates are very much guesswork, and they might be wrong. There might have been more variation. After that, you'd become a provincial governor or an army commander in a military province. That's legatus Augusti pro praetore, usually in your early 40s. And again, the post tended to last on average about 3 years, but some men could be in office for the best part of a decade. But that tended to be exceptional circumstances. By the middle of the 2nd century AD, there was a trend where the 3 most important military posts, so that's province of Britain, before it's divided into 2, Upper Pannonia on the Danube, and Syria, which have got the largest armies of any of the provinces by this time. You only hold this job after you've been governor of a normal military province. So the emphasis was these are important, we need men the emperor really trusts, both trust politically and in terms of reliability, but also in terms of capacity. They're not going to foul up with a really big and important army, because that's where the biggest military challenges are most likely to emerge. So that's broadly the pattern. You've also had earlier some legionary legates end up commanding a smaller military province. During this career, you will also have most likely governed a senatorial province that doesn't have a legionary garrison but might have some auxiliary units or even some legionary detachments there. So even in those basically civil posts, you might have had some small experience of command. You might have been involved in operation against, bandits, this sort of thing, but not a big deal. So that's the formal experience you had, and that has always led scholars, whether academics or those coming from military background, to look at Roman high command and say, well, these people do seem to be a load of amateurs. They're not professional soldiers. They've received no formal military education whatsoever. And the logical conclusion of that, as far as we're concerned, is that, well, they're not likely to be very good soldiers, are they? They're not really knowing what they're doing. And this led to a theory you got particularly in the first half of the 20th century, but it still pops up now and again, that the entire command structure of the Roman army was based upon taking responsibility away from the senior commanders, that battles could be run by the centurions, the professional officers, we'll come on to them in a minute, because they were good and knew what they were doing, whereas you had some chinless wonder of an aristocrat in overall charge who took the glory and the credit but didn't have a clue what he was doing. It's not a view that makes much sense, but nevertheless, it was coming from looking at from a modern point of view and saying, well, they don't seem to have vast amounts of military experience. They don't have any formal training at all. So how could someone like this command an army? And you've got the point that tribunes, the legionary tribunes in particular, but also the equestrian ones, may well have owed that posting to favour of the provincial governor. There's some evidence you could ask for someone. Ultimately, the appointment will come from the emperor, but the emperor doesn't necessarily know everybody very well and also wants a degree of harmony within the high command of his province, but also not too much because he doesn't want anybody to get ideas and rebel against him. All other appointments are made by the emperor. So the emperor chooses the commanders of legions, he chooses the governors of the military provinces that are under his control. That's all of them. So he is going to be very careful who gets these jobs. But then the argument will be, well, with Roman society is his main interest, like a lot of autocratic regimes throughout history, in ensuring that he gets loyal men in these appointments, or does he want the best and most capable men in these appointments? Or some balance between the two, where you trade off and think, well, I don't want my army run by a bunch of complete planks because any defeats will reflect badly on me. But on the other hand, I don't want them run by potential Julius Caesars who are going to cross the Rubicon and start civil wars and all that sort of thing. So that's the traditional view. They're amateur, they're inexperienced. Because they're inexperienced, they must generally be incompetent, and the system required them to master only very simple drills. Centurions were the real professionals. And this is the persistent misunderstanding that just seems to be there, and people come up with again and again. Maybe it's a bit less common now, but I'm surprised how often academics still rather dismiss centurions and just lump them in with the rank and file of the army and assume that they're all basically the same. They're all from the poor and they have similar attitudes towards society, towards politics and all this sort of thing. They're not part of the elite. They're not really that significant. The idea was, and it was strong in the German literature, which very much shaped how we view the Roman army in the early part of the 20th century. The Prussian and then German army tends to have a lot more non-commissioned officers with significantly more responsibility than they have in a formal sense in, say, the British system. And then a lot of British scholars who served in the world wars or then were doing their national service, and that group in particular influenced archaeological thought, Roman army studies for a long time during the second half of the 20th century. In the British army, the sergeant majors, the warrant officers, CPOs and others in the Navy, the equivalent, are very, very impressive individuals who have got there on ability. And so many of them are extremely good, know what they're doing, and seem awfully grown up and responsible compared to the callow, irresponsible officers. Again, you could see this when I was in the OTC. The warrant officers we had were very, very impressive people, and you greatly valued. We had a BSM whose simple comment after if we'd done something well was, "Yeah, I'm happy with that." That meant a lot. I haven't had quite as many compliments I've valued as much as the occasional ones when something I was doing, or more often a group was doing, we got that from the BSM. But again, that's projecting how things work and in the modern army and saying, well, the Romans are just like that. The assumption tended to be, and you still get this in some studies of centurions, that they were mostly promoted from the ranks on the basis of ability. They were our sergeant major types. But if we look at a couple of careers, doesn't really suggest that necessarily. Now, the big problem with centurions' careers is that they are mostly known, almost exclusively, from inscriptions, from epigraphic records, and primarily from tombstones where somebody, at the end of their life, someone commemorates them and they say, well, I was centurion of this, that, and the other. Many will simply mention being centurion of a particular legion, or sometimes a cohort or auxiliary unit, and that's it. And they don't tell us necessarily how long, though sometimes they'll tell us how long they served in the army, but they don't tell us, did they do anything before, did they do anything afterwards. The assumption was for a very long time with most scholars that they only ever mentioned being a centurion because any prior service was seen as somehow less prestigious, dishonorable, so you didn't mention it, but the viewer would know you would have done that to get there, and therefore it didn't need to be said. But of course that's an assumption you can turn on your head and say, well, actually, the observer would have known that most people were directly commissioned as centurions, and that's all they ever did. They were professional officers rather than professional soldiers. So we'll look at a couple of careers. Again, there's a much more detailed video on these two individuals, so I won't go into it at huge length, but it's interesting because it gives us an idea of the sort of men who could be centurions. So let's look at Petronius Fortunatus from a tombstone in North Africa, and from the late 1st, early 2nd century AD. He enlisted in Legio I Italica in the ranks. However, in 4 years, he's in the ranks for 4 years, or a junior post for 4 years, he held the ranks of librarius, that's a clerk, so that means he's literate when he goes in, and he's given a comfortable billet in the HQ rather than more menial duties. He's then tesserarius, that's keeper of the password, something close to being an NCO, a non-commissioned officer as we would understand it, though again the term doesn't quite fit the Roman system. Optio, that's second in command of the century, and signifer, the standard bearer of the century, again one of the junior officers stroke warrant officers stroke NCOs, that sort of job, the people who supported the centurion who commands the century, nominally of 80 men. So in 4 years he's held 4 pretty significant responsibilities. So if he's been an ordinary soldier, it hasn't been for very long. It's basically his, if they had an equivalent of basic training, which presumably they did, and there are hints that they do, he's done that, but then he's gone to be a clerk. He's been the principales, they're called, the 3 posts below a centurion, the men who help him run the century. He's then promoted to centurion in the same legion by the vote of his comrades, which is interesting, by acclamation, or as a result of, it occasionally seems to happen when a legion has done well that a commander of, with using the emperor's authority, allows the soldiers to choose who's going to be promoted, acclaim him as the bravest, the most capable, whatever it might be. We don't know the details here, but that could happen. Presumably does with him. It's fairly rare. That's an exception, which is why he boasts about it. If it was the sort of thing that everybody assumed, oh yeah, that's normal, then presumably he wouldn't have told us. Over the next 46 years, incredibly long career as an officer, he serves as centurion with the 6th Legion Ferrata in Syria, 1st Minervia, Lower Germany, 10th Gemina, Upper Pannonia, Danube, 2nd Augusta, Britain, 3rd Augusta, Numidia, North Africa, 3rd Gallica, Syria again, 30th Ulpia, Lower Germany again, 6th Victrix, Britain again, 3rd Cyrenaica, Arabia, 15th Apollinaris, Cappadocia, Eastern Turkey today, 2nd Parthica, probably in Italy, but it moved around with the emperor, 1st Adjutrix, either Upper or Lower Pannonia, and he's decorated with a mural crown given to the first man over the wall of an enemy town, other decorations including torques and phalarai. So some of these were things you would get almost with the rations if you did well enough. It's like sort of civil service awards. But others are genuine decorations for gallantry only to be earned on campaign. And it goes back to probably that vote is because he's done something very brave or been the man that's is generally considered to be the best and bravest of them in those early days. His tombstone mentions a son who died aged 35 and had served in the army for 6 years as a centurion in 22nd Primigenia and then 2nd Augusta, the latter in Britain at that time, and one of his father's legions. So if he's died in service, then he's gone in and he's done 6 years. He hasn't joined until he's 29, the junior. So it's a different pattern. But again, not that I've been an ordinary soldier and I've been promoted. This man just seems to be purely a centurion. So here you have a career professional officer, a very, very long-serving professional officer. Let's look at another one. We've got Caius Octavius Honoratus, another tombstone found in Africa, who tells us he was directly commissioned as a centurion from the equestrian order in Legio II Augusta in Britain. So he is a member of this class just below the Senate that provides provides 5 tribunes per legion, also provides the officers for the auxilia that are more responsible jobs than at least the starting point of a centurion's career. So it's interesting he chooses, as do others. He isn't the only example of this. There are 20 or so at least that we know where equestrians go into the centurionate in the legions. And then he served successively in the 7th Legion, Claudia Pia Fidelis in Upper Moesia, again Danube, nearer the Black Sea, that area. 16th Flavia Firma, that's Syria. 10th Gemina, Upper Pannonia. Ended his service as a princeps posterior, the 4th senior grade of centurion in ordinary cohort, cohorts 5 of 10th Gemina. It doesn't give any details of age or length of service. But again, this is a man who started as a centurion and then stayed as a centurion. He hasn't got to the top grade of the centurionate, so that would be, this is basically, there are 6 centuries of 80 men in your cohort of 480. Again, paper strengths, not necessarily reality. He's got halfway. There's 2 posts below him, 3 posts above him in terms of seniority. So it isn't necessarily that spectacular a career, which is interesting, but again, we don't know how long he was there. So, if you think about the centurions, then these don't have any formal training to be a centurion, to be an officer, to command them. Some have served in junior posts, like Fortunatus, but Octavius hasn't. He's just gone straight in as a company commander equivalent. First lieutenant, captain, depends on the organization at the time. Even the grades within the system, it's very, very complicated, and I've talked a little bit about this. I will talk in even more detail at some point, but there were various theories that your prestige, your status, your seniority was based around not just which point you were, whether you were the pilus prae or pilus posterior, this sort of thing, or within your particular cohort, or also which cohort you're in, and that maybe first cohort was most prestigious, 10th cohort least prestigious, all this sort of thing, and you'd work your way up from each one. None of the formal systems have really made too much sense. There is clearly a distinction, though. This affected where the century stood in any formation in the battle line, because that seems to have been based around these titles for the individual centurion. And it might well be that this also means that you put any centurions together in one place, regardless if they're from different units, they could work out okay, I've got this post, I am Hastatus Prior, but you're Pedis Posterior, therefore you're more senior to me. If you've got the same rank, then maybe it comes to length of service or something like that. And that you could throw them together and they would be able to work out quickly who was in charge, rather like the seniority system in the British Army. You know, in the 19th century, think of the film Zulu, where you have Bromhead and Chard sort of saying, you know, which of us is senior, based on the date of their commission. There's also no organized system of selection for centurions. So there aren't, you know, you don't get the impression of people going out and saying, join the army, this is a centurion career, apply now, and this is the selection process we'll go through. Patronage is important. We've mentioned earlier that it seems as if a lot of tribunes could be chosen by the governor, even if obviously they had to be approved by the emperor. Centurions, it seems to be the same, and so patronage that is the, you know, the oil that makes the Roman Empire work, just as important in the army as it was in civilian society. If you had somebody to speak for you, and this comes back to, you know, Juvenal's fragmentary satire on the army, talks about how, you know, you want a letter of recommendation from Venus and Mars and this sort of thing when you go to join up. The famous letter from Egypt of a man who's brought along his letters of recommendation gets made a clerk quickly whilst the recruits he came with are out breaking rocks in the quarry. He's snug indoors. You know, was that the story of Petronius Fortunatus when he got his clerk's post early on? So it relies on patronage, and again, modern armies tend to work on very formal systems where you have certain requirements to go in, whether of age, education, other achievements, physical tests, all this sort of thing, to be selected for that route in that marks you out for a particular career path, assuming you follow the other things. So clear distinctions between going in as an officer, going in the ranks, this sort of thing, but you have then junior leader programs and all this sort of thing. The cadet system that operated in a lot of European armies for a very long time, where you were marked out for an officer's career, but you did service in the ranks. If we think back to the 19th century up until Cardwell Army reforms, purchase within the army, that a significant minority of British Army officers bought their initial commission and then steps of promotion as they went up. Again, it was always a minority, it was never everybody. And the idea was that they had a stake in society, in government, and therefore weren't likely to become revolutionaries and would fight all the harder. But also it gave them a pension, effectively, that when they decided to leave the army, they could sell their commission, and that would bring them money that would help support them, which meant the state didn't have to worry too much about looking after them in other respects. So it was sort of, you know, worked that way. Now, the patronage system did produce a significant and disturbing number of, the purchase system, along with patronage, did produce incompetence. You know, you have Sir William Erskine, the madman, you know, who was sent out to command a division, the Light Division, for a while in the Peninsular War, even though Wellington is saying, I generally considered him to be a madman, and a disturbing letter from the ministry talking about, oh, he's a, you know, commonly clever fellow in his lucid moments, but did look a little bit wild when I saw him off, you know, eventually commit suicide, jumping out of a high window. You get those, but you also get the Duke of Wellington, you get the Sir John Moores, you get a lot of very capable people end up at senior posts much sooner than they would have done if they'd had to work their way up step by step in a way that was fair. Now, obviously, it's a pretty arbitrary system, and you're running the risk of extremes, that the occasional natural genius or person who is capable of learning with lots of others who are appalling and don't have a clue. Notice that the Royal Navy at the same time does not allow for purchase, because you can't put somebody who's bought their way and has not a clue how to sail something as expensive as HMS Victory or something like that and let him run it aground or lose it in a storm just because he comes from the right background and have the money to buy the posts. But even within the Navy, patronage is a big, big factor in promotion and giving you those plum commands and your opportunities and all this sort of thing. So they sometimes get people who have better patrons than they do actually have personal talent. But on the whole, the standard is more professional. Again, one of the mysteries of the army, British Army of that period, is that Far less is recorded specifically about the training done at unit level and then at higher level when you had these inspections going around that you sort of get hints at in the sources, but what it actually involves. There's perhaps more going on than we might like to think, but nevertheless, some very gifted commanders are produced by such a system, and on the whole, from particularly under Wellington, Moore, people like that, the British Army does rather well in that period, but it's also done really badly in Flanders and things in the 1790s. So you can get the extremes, but the system itself produces both. And you obviously have to decide what the balance is. Does it tend towards effectiveness, or does it tend towards incompetence and disaster? Or are other factors in play so that you can get away with a level of incompetence and still win? So you have that sense of learning by experience. Again, no formal training. The staff college is created, or the origins of it become created in this period, but only a very small number of graduates come through it to play any role in this. The artillery, the engineers have been formally training people because, again, you need to know what you're doing. You're doing that, but they don't tend to get high command. And again, it's that distinction that will last through for a long time. So you need to allow for other factors. Upbringing, these people are raised to assume that they should be in charge and that they're used to giving orders, they're used to dealing with people, addressing crowds, supervising, that sort of thing. The Roman culture is very much one of learn by observing others, learn by experience, learn by watching, but also by doing. Not learn by theory, by training, by preparation. Yes, you'll get rhetorical training to be a politician, but then you're supposed to follow your father or a male relative around, watch him going about his duties as a senator, listen at the open doors of the Senate during its meetings, get a sense of how they do things, and pick it up as you go along. And by watching others and surrounding yourself with capable people, their attitude towards military life is very, very similar. Yes, there are some things you need to be taught, how to ride, how to use a sword, how to throw a javelin, this sort of thing. But most of it you will learn by experience. And then you come into this informal training where you go off as a youngster and you accompany a male relative in his posting to command a legion, to command a province, and this sort of thing, so that you are around army bases, army camps. You are starting to have a sense of how a headquarters works, and you are getting involved in that at that stage. So there are informal ways of learning, and there's a lot that won't necessarily appear in the sources. So it doesn't mean that any of these systems automatically produce a load of incompetence. Yes, there are some people who are no good, but there are others that are okay, and plenty more that actually do prove to be quite good. Within the restrictions of the time, you're not, as the Roman army, fighting another professional army that has formal training for its high command. So everybody you're fighting has learnt as they've gone along according to the ways of doing things of their society. And again, that's quite similar in the Napoleonic context, in that, yes, the French have been promoting talent, but with patronage playing an influence going through since the Revolution. But you don't go on a course before you qualify to become general de brigade, general de division, whatever it might be, or let alone a marshal. You're selected, you're assumed to have learnt as you're going along, and yes, to have some appreciation of the theory, but it's not done in that same way. And again, some of them prove spectacularly good, but you do have the good old Peter principle where you promote them to a point where they've been really good, but eventually they end up out of their depth and don't cope quite so well. So the system requires a lot of senior officers within the Roman army, because you've got the senatorial commanders that are serving for these comparatively short periods of time. They're not going off and then commanding a legion for 20 years or more. They're not in the army full time. So lots of people are getting a turn, and they're getting to go out to the provinces. They're getting to command a legion. They're getting to be a tribune. Even more equestrians are going into this. There are as many auxiliaries overall as there are legionaries, at least that, probably more as time goes on, which means that you have all these cohort and ala commanders are required. And again, they seem to serve for a few years before moving on to another post. So an awful lot of people are required by this system. Centurions are also not professional soldiers in the way that we see the warrant officers of the British Army, say. They're professional officers. Direct evidence, clear evidence, unambiguous evidence on the tombstones suggests that only a minority were actually promoted from the ranks. And in some cases, like Petronius Fortunatus, they've had an incredibly rapid career. They've very quickly gone to junior posts. So it's again the sort of thing that would have been possible in the Second World War. Any periods of intense activity, big expansion of the army. You have people who are sergeants when they're 19, 20, this sort of thing, whereas take another decade or so at least to do it in peacetime, because of the requirement, because they've shown talent. So you have centurions who are recruited as centurions, or in a few cases they might be an operator, a signifer, one of the principales, and then become a centurion, but spend the bulk of their career as centurions of different grades, becoming ever more senior. It's probably better to think of them as from the middle classes, as long as you don't employ modern ideas of class and a middle class too rigidly to the Roman Empire, but people who economically are not from the very poor, and some of them, quite a lot of the people joining the legions in the ranks come from that level. The Emperor Tiberius complains that nobody in Italy who wasn't a vagrant or a sort of petty criminal was enlisting in the legions. Nobody wanted to do it. It was just too dangerous, too far away. There's always been that element where a bad harvest can recruit a lot of country lads who want some adventure, are fed up at home, but also the prospects for work at home aren't very good. We've got to remember people like the Gaius Octavius Honoratus, an equestrian who chooses to become a legionary centurion, and he is not alone. We have to assume the ones who mention it on their tombstone do so because this was a point of honor. I'm an equestrian, not just a centurion, so I'm better. So we assume that the others out there don't mention this because that wasn't the case, that they've come in. But they've come from, people quite often, that gives an idea of the pay, the status of being a centurion. So other examples we find from the rewards given to troops, you could see this in the triumphs right back into the Republic. Centurions always get at least double and often 5 or even 10 times more than ordinary soldiers. These are big differences. In 48 BC, Caesar awards a particularly distinguished centurion, a chap called Sciver, with money, and gives him the equivalent of 200 years' worth of pay for an ordinary soldier. I think that's a big, big sum. That is raising you to an economic level that your ordinary legionary could only dream about. Late 1st century AD, the younger Pliny gives a chap called Metilius, for whom he's secured a commission as centurion in one of the legions. He gives him 10,000 denarii to equip himself with the uniform, the horse or two probably, the equipment, the camp, provisions, equipment, all this sort of thing required for his job as a centurion. At that point, a legionary is being paid 300 denarii a year. So 30 years' salary for an ordinary soldier is what's felt to be required for a man to equip himself respectably to serve as a centurion, which again comes back to that idea you'd have in the British Army of the 19th century in particular, where you actually needed a private income to serve in some units to be able to afford the uniform, the horses required, the hussars and people like this, incredibly expensive. And if you didn't have that income in addition to your pay, you probably wouldn't be able to cope, particularly in those fashionable, expensive units. So we're looking at something much more close, perhaps, to that concept of what an officer is when we're dealing with centurions. And again, there is no formal training for centurions. They don't go to a college or a school to be prepared for this. They are appointed, and some of them can be appointed from civilian life in that rank. With patronage, they could achieve that rank at 18. We know of at least one centurion who's an 18-year-old appointed to a legion, and advance quickly. Many of the plum jobs for a centurion weren't necessarily serving with your unit, serving with your legion, but they were serving on attachment with the governor's staff. They were serving, being in charge of traffic through a particular city, regional centurion, being put in charge of detachments here, there, and everywhere. Again, we've talked about this in other videos. When we get strength reports for Roman army units, a high proportion of their officers tend to be elsewhere, not with the parent unit. One of the reasons for this is that, as far as we can tell, the Romans only had a set number of posts for centurion, decurion, whatever it might be, tribune, and that was based on the number of units. So you couldn't just be a centurion unattached, not belonging to a legion or an auxiliary cohort somewhere. You had to have taken a slot that came from one of those units, even if you rarely actually saw that unit. So again, think of Petronius Fortunatus, that long list of legions where he served from one end of the empire to the other, from Britain to Syria. Did he physically go to all of those units, or was he engaged on other tasks, but he got the slot and perhaps the jump in status of, you know, moving up a grade within the centurionate, which brought prestige, probably better pay, seniority, all this sort of thing. Or did he physically go? We don't know from that inscription. It does not tell us in any way. So many on detached duty, and that rank system of prestige, the thing we don't understand, adds to it. The big thing to emphasize is that centurion is not a single rank. It is a grade of officer. It is more like commissioned officer, warrant officer, non-commissioned officer, this sort of thing. That sort of status within which there is a broad range of responsibilities, authority, prestige, pay, all of these things. So, in a moment, we'll look, starting with high command, at what Roman commanders, what Roman generals were supposed to do on campaign and particularly in battle. But let's just look at a couple of examples from the sources when people talk about what commanders were supposed to do. So this one comes from a theoretical book, though a very literary stylized one, written by a Greek, Onosander, but dedicated to a man who became governor of Britain. So someone who was actually having a proper senatorial career, bringing him important military posts. He said this, talking about the general in battle: "The duty of a general is to ride by the ranks on horseback, show himself to those in danger, praise the brave, threaten the cowardly, encourage the lazy, fill up gaps, transpose a unit if necessary, bring aid to the wearied, anticipate the crisis, the hour, and the outcome." I'll come back to this later, but it suggests a very mobile, interventionist style of command. Then more generally, in Plutarch's biography of Marius, the famous commander who defeated the Cimbrian Teutones at the end of the 2nd century BC, is often credited with overseeing major reforms in the Roman army, and while that view's less fashionable now, he was certainly an important military name and Roman commander. Plutarch says this: "What a Roman soldier likes most to see is his generals sleeping on an ordinary bed, or joining in the work of digging a trench or raising a palisade. The commanders whom they admire are not so much those who distribute honors and riches as those who take a share in their hardships and danger. They have more affection for those who are willing to join in their work than for those who indulge them in easy going." And then later on in the same biography, when Marius is seriously ill with a fever, and he's a fugitive, he's done badly in a civil war, there's this interesting little passage that I remember again. Actually, it was a drink stew at St. John's College when I was a student, somebody pointing this out to me, because I hadn't noticed the passage before. It wasn't in a section where I expected it to be talking about military events. But anyway, Marius, according to Plutarch, imagined that he was commander-in-chief in the war with Mithridates, and then behaved just as he used to when really in action, throwing himself into all sorts of attitudes, going through various movements, shouting words of command, constantly yelling out his battle cry. So those are interesting as to a sense of what a commander was supposed to do, how he was supposed to act, how he was supposed to behave, with Plutarch in the second passage emphasizing very much the general as simple soldier. And you get this theme cropping up with several commanders at different periods, including emperors later on, that they wear ordinary soldier's uniform, or at least a version of it. You know, fairly simple. They're not flamboyant, overdressed, everything spectacular. They are mucking in. You have stories of the Emperor Caracalla receiving a grain ration and grinding it in a hand mill. Now, whether he just did this once or twice for the sort of the equivalent of a photo op, so the word would get around, that's what the emperor does. Whether he does it regularly, that sense of, well, I'm going to share everything with my men, so I'll know what they can do, what's reasonable to expect from them, and I'm not getting preferential treatment. Corbulo, similar things, talked about him, how he marches on foot, leads them on their marches. Julius Caesar, the same, in all weathers. Hard trainer, but shares the dangers, shares the hardships with them. So that's interesting in terms of the approach. And it comes back in part, there's some of the origins of this are the fact that back in the days of the Republic, your commanders were people you had elected, and they were all citizens serving together in different capacities, because that was based on their status within the community, but we're all in this together. It's not them and us, we're all us. That was at least the idea they were trying to present. But also the practical view, in that setting examples in these ways can work. As with everything else in life, some people are better at it than others. Some will always come across as acting. It's the politician who goes and orders fish and chips in a cafe somewhere. Some of them look as if they might naturally do that. Others look so completely and hopelessly out of place that it doesn't convince everybody to think, oh yes, he's just like us, let's vote for him. I remember hearing a story of some family who were, and this was back in the 1950s, picnicking up in the Black Mountains in Wales, and they saw a very prominent Labour politician arrive in his Bentley and then switch to a very small, rather basic car before he drove into town for a function, so that he could arrive as, oh, he's just one of us, and all this sort of thing. So people construct these images, and it can work very, very well. They just happen to be sitting there and just watched all this going on. So even when it's phony, it can work. Even if it's an act, some people are good actors. But there's, there are grades to this. It isn't just a simple, this is what you do, everybody does this. And also the implication that certain commanders do this suggests that others did not. And you do get glimpses of other traditions with people who are much tougher as disciplinarians, much more distant. Even to the extent, and this was partly because he didn't want civil wars happening, that Augustus is said to have refused to call the soldiers commilitones, comrades, the word Caesar always used, and forbidden his family from doing the same. So the relationship will vary depending on who it is at different periods. And sometimes, if you trust the person in charge, then the austere, the distant, the Duke of Wellington doesn't encourage cheering because that might mean they can expect to boo when they feel like it as well. That sense, that can work if you're a winner and people believe, okay, we're with this bloke, then we're going to be all right, we're going to win, which means we're probably going to survive, we're probably going to get profit as well from loot and all this sort of thing. In the end, you don't want to march to your doom if you can possibly avoid it. So let's look at the job, what generals did in battle, but start off before battle. So big choices when and where to fight. By the time of the Principate, you're dealing more and more often with less formally organized societies you're fighting. An awful lot of battles tend to be encounter battles where you bump into the enemy. And a common one is the Romans launch a punitive expedition, march into enemy territory, say beyond the Rhine or something, into Germany, burn down some villages, try and capture some people. On the way back, they encounter an army of the tribes that's been able to muster by this time, that's waiting on the obvious route to fight them and try and stop them get home, because they haven't been able to react quickly enough. If you get raids into Roman territory, as those who've watched the channel any detail will know, raiding's a big thing for me, then the Romans won't often catch people coming in, but they might catch the raiders on their way back, and that might sometimes lead to a battle on a small or large scale. Often there's the desire as well to fight the enemy wherever you can find the enemy, because the enemy can be elusive, and you've got a big, powerful, confident field force. You feel that if you meet them in the open, you can defeat them, almost under any circumstance, almost regardless of the odds. So Roman armies will be very bold, very aggressive, and will fight sometimes in terrain that might seem to be against them because they want to meet the enemy and beat them, and they think they can, and usually they do. However, it's still a very, very important decision just when to fight, whether you did fight immediately, delay a few hours, delay a day or so, this sort of thing. Reconnaissance by senior officers, including the commander himself, very, very common. Your intelligence gathering, your scouting is extremely important, something we can talk about another day, but the number of times officers will go and look on their own. This is true of Caesar, it's true of most of the ones where we get any sort of detailed description, particularly common for sieges. Titus twice rides up and has a look at Jerusalem. Trajan goes to look at Hatra, and a man next to him is shot by an arrow, because they've seen, even though Trajan is wearing plain uniform at that time, it's like Napoleon dressing as a corporal on the Danube, all this sort of thing, putting on an ordinary soldier's greatcoat. Nevertheless, Trajan just looks significantly older, has grey hair. So that is the thought that that's what made the defenders think, oh, let's have a pot at this chap, might be worth it. So very important and sometimes dangerous, but it's about getting as much information as you can on which to base your decision. You would then have the concilium, translates as council, often as council of war, though that's rather misleading. In British Army context, it's basically much more like an O group. It's not a forum for debate unless the commander asks for opinions. And the commander always has the final say. It's where he talks about things, explain things, people can raise, oh, I've got, not sure I can do that, could I do it this way? And then be told yes or no. But it is not a forum for debate where they vote for, this is what we're going to do, which you've had in some of the democratic systems. You get the impression that's how the Athenians often worked on campaign, and probably others. Now, again, it's expected for a Roman aristocrat to seek the advice of friends, family, people who know what they're talking about. But again, it's seeking the advice, the opinion, getting information from them, and then you decide, and that's what is done. And so it's a mixture of exchange of ideas, but then this is the instruction, this is what we're going to do. It's a very traditional Roman way of doing things. It's also a way to explain those orders. So it isn't simply that I've written these instructions, this is what you're going to do, this is what I want, this is how I want it done, and then, as I say, you can debate, you can discuss, and either say, okay, yes, that's a better way of doing it, you do that, or no, it's got to fit with the plan, do this. Depending on the size of the army, if it's a small army, you might have centurions present as well, so that otherwise, if it's a very large army, then you'll have the senior officers who will then go back and hold their own concilia with their immediate deputies and perhaps another level as well, to explain down to the point where you get to the orders to unit level. You've also then got very close supervision of deployment. This is important in a lot of respects because obviously you want to make sure that the orders, the plan you've got is being implemented in the way you want it, but also in mass formations where you've got people who are fighting shoulder to shoulder effectively, or very relatively close. Anyway, in close formations, in the same way you would have in the 18th, 19th centuries, what each unit does has implications for everybody on either side of them for the overall deployment and space. So it's often a mistake to think that there's lots of initiative to the equivalent of sort of cohort battalion commanders, that sort of thing, that they can do whatever formation they like or all this sort of thing. That is extremely unlikely. And you look at the orders issued at corps and divisional level in the Napoleonic era, they tend to be very, very prescriptive about the formations you're going to employ. There's also the habit element that may come back to the way that the centurion command structure works and all these different appointments. In the British Army of Wellington's era, seniority was very, very important. It affected where companies stood in the line of their individual battalion. It then determined where those battalions would stand in position to other units within their brigade. So the most senior unit would always be on the right, next most senior on the left, and then the third most senior, second from the right, and so on. From that, unless you deployed opposite to normal, we call left in front, where everything would be reversed. But the point was that when you were given that instruction, this is how you're going to do it, everybody knew, okay, that means that unit's over there, and this is where we are, and this is who's going to be next to us. So there are routines that come in that speed up this process and means that everybody should know where they are. In the wider context of the British one of the army, then where a brigade was would be determined by the seniority of the brigade commander. Again, from that most senior being on the right, next most senior on the left, and so on. There's a fair chance that the ranks within the centurionate, the grade within the centurionate, helped the Romans to understand this. So if you knew which cohort you were in, but particularly which century you were in, then you'd always know, okay, we're deploying and those people are going to be on our right, those people are going to be on our left. And the unit-wise, that's where we are. So a lot of that we don't know what the system was, and it isn't always obvious until you look closely and somebody points it out to you that that's what the British Army is doing in the Peninsular War and at Waterloo. And then it's really obvious, and you just look and think, oh yes, and it makes a lot of sense. So it's an extension of that almost unspoken thing, that routine that's so natural to everybody within the system, they don't bother to talk about it. The Romans have these things, we just don't know what they are. We can only guess at them. Right, in battle, we're not going to talk about tactics in any detail today. I'll deal with that another time. A couple of things that are worth mentioning is the importance of the multiple line system. The famous is the triple exachies, the 3 lines of a legion where you have probably 4 cohorts in the front line, 3 in the second, 3 in the third. Goes back to the old Republican system where the lines were based on age and to some extent minor way on equipment, lines of maniples. That's remained. Still the commonest form of deployment, but legions might deploy into 2 lines, 4 lines. Auxilia might be integrated into the system. They might form a front line with legionaries behind them, legionary cohorts. These are lines of units, not individual just ranks. Entire legions could be kept in reserves in certain circumstances. It depends on the situation, the size of the army, the layout, topography of the battlefield, the frontage that's involved, and what you're trying to do. And you can get Roman armies moving in basically a large hollow square or more than one when they're moving through wooded, restricted terrain in Germany where they can't see where the enemy are, when they're moving in the east where you have very mobile Parthians or Persians who can easily surround you, and in other circumstances like that. The big thing is that there's always a high proportion, a high percentage of the army is kept in reserve at the start of the battle, and that's something very significant when we come back to consider, well, just how does the system work? What does it want a commander to do? But usually 2/3 of your army, half your army, is going to be kept back from the initial fighting line. Even if there's some evidence that first and second lines work together quite closely, so you could consider the second line as sort of immediate supports of the first line, even then you normally have a third line, so 1/3 of your army is kept in reserve to be committed later on. Now that might not sound that exciting till you realize just how rare this is for ancient armies. If you think of the predecessors to the Romans in terms of the most sophisticated, all-arm drilled, sophisticated, complicated command structure army would be the Macedonian Hellenistic style. And yet Alexander the Great didn't tend to use reserves. Philip didn't. Most of their successors did not, largely because they are commanding from the front line and leading charges. Now, there are 3 basic choices for where to command in battle. You can command from the front ranks. You can lead, literally, by fighting hand to hand. Now, Marius may well have done this in the first battle he fights against the Cimbrian Teutones, but you could interpret the Greek of Plutarch as either he's actually in the front rank or he's very close to it, but he's taking his place there. And he's setting an example. A whole succession of Roman armies has been wiped out by these same migrating barbarians. And understandably, the troops facing them this time would be pretty nervous. So therefore, it's an example. He sends his horse away, takes his place in the front rank. The general is with us. He's confident we're going to win. We're going to survive. So that inspires us. He's not said to have done this at any other occasion, so it does seem to be a one-off. Because once you're there, there's no real command role you can perform. You're going to be too busy staying alive. At most, you can act as a sort of junior officer, subaltern, centurion, that sort of level, motivating those immediately around you. Anybody who can see you, who can hear you. But not more than that. You're certainly not going to be sending orders back to reserves to say, right, I want you to come in, because you have no sense of the wider battlefield. Now, this is very much the Alexander the Great style of command in the big battles. Deployment, very careful, advance, very careful, then he puts himself at the head of the royal layer of companions and steams towards the enemy, spear in hand, and hacks his way through them. While doing that, he gives an immense morale boost to the army because they know their general is sharing every danger, in many ways, is in greater danger than they are. he is leading them. They are his companions, his hetairoi, and therefore they're going with him. But he can't do much, he can't see much. You have the bit later on in the breakup of the battlefield at Gaugamela, he gets a report from his left flank that they're in trouble and is asked to help. But that's after the fighting has broken up to some extent, and he's already broken through and is on the verge of a major pursuit to complete the victory. But otherwise, he doesn't recon. He relies on the fact that all along the line of the Macedonian army, there are subordinate commanders who are capable men who do their job and know what to do. So if there's a problem, they deal with it. But he's committed just about everything. At Gaugamela, they have a second line, but it's almost like the hollow square formation to prevent against outflanking. And it doesn't seem to do a great deal. It's not a true reserve, as we would understand it. It's just protecting your flanks and rear. Otherwise, he does not put his disciplined Macedonians in reserve. It's all in the shop front window. It's all there to give a coordinated, heavy attack on the enemy in one go, because he is not in a position where he could control things. We'll do a talk more generally about leaders in battles and how this develops. It changes a little bit under the successors, and particularly some people like Pyrrhus. It's more a modified version. You could command from the rear rather than from the front rank. Tacitus rather implies Agricola does this at the Battle of Mons Graupius. He's not described, I mean, there's very little description of what he's doing other than his decisions, but those are what's emphasized. It's committing reserve units, basically, extra cavalry, more infantry at various stages to complete the victory, having ordered the initial attacks. You're able to command from the rear. You're not so able to inspire. You have a wide perspective. You don't necessarily see the details. You've got to read what's happening on the battlefield from a different sense. You get, particularly in the context, not necessarily just of sieges, but of fighting near cities. Often in early stages of those, you have fighting outside the city walls in the open. Titus in Jerusalem climbs, they keep one turret of the fortress of Antonia, so he can observe fighting going on in the temple in Jerusalem. Tiberius in Illyria, before he was emperor, they build a platform for him, a tower basically, from which he can observe the fighting. So it does sometimes happen, but usually in fairly unusual situations. You can observe, you can see a lot, it's not always adequate. At Gamala, the assault on the city there, Vespasian hangs back at first, but because he can't see what's going on and doesn't understand it, he then pushes forward into the fighting and ends up getting wounded in the foot. Because he gets that close. But it's that sense of, I need to know what's going on. And this is a problem that is faced in any period of history for any sort of commander, particularly at that high level. Where should you be? Are you right in the thick of it, where you get a very clear sense of what's happening, at least at that point in the fighting, but you're at risk and you don't see what's happening elsewhere? Or do you stay back, in which case you might not be able to see things until it's too late, and you can't inspire people, you can't grab someone and say, right, you and you do that, and it can happen immediately. Everything is delayed because you've got to send instructions, they've then got to be acted upon. So it's a dilemma. There are risks to any approach, any of these approaches, either of them, whether you're very far forward or whether you're at the back. But both of those types, the right at the front and right at the back, are fairly rare. The common one comes back to the Onosander passage we read at the beginning, where the general is riding around, keeping a close eye on things, but moving. So the idea is to stay behind the fighting line, but fairly close to it, ideally on horseback. Occasionally, his first battle in Gaul, Caesar sends his horse away. Catiline, the rebel, does the same in his last stand battle. But again, in each case, it's to show the men, I won't run, I'm staying with you, have confidence, we are going to win, I believe we will win. Spartacus, in his last battle, kills his horse. Perhaps a sacrifice, but there's an element of, well, you know, I'm not going to escape if you don't, sort of thing, and we're going to win this. So what you get is the coming forward, getting close to the fighting, able to judge from the noise, the posture, what was going on. You can encourage the soldiers. Strong belief they're being watched by a general inspired them. So let's come, I've used this passage before, it's in the Caesar talk, but it's well worth going through again, so that this is from Caesar at the Battle of the Sabis, possibly the River Sambre, possibly not, depends on your point of view, but doesn't really matter for our purposes today. 57 BC, fighting against a confederation of Belgic tribes. The start of the battle, when his army is beginning to encamp and is attacked, is surprised by an enemy that's been waiting in undercover, hidden by woods, hidden by folds in the ground, this sort of thing, and attacks across the river. At the beginning, Caesar had to do everything at the same time: to raise the standard, which is the signal to stand to arms, sound the trumpet call, which recalled the soldiers from work, to bring back the men who'd gone further afield in search of material for the rampart, to form the line of battle, to address the soldiers, give the signal for battle. So that's the sense of all the things I'd normally do, I have to do in a rush, and I don't necessarily get them all done in time, but well enough. And then moving on, after addressing Legio 10, Caesar hurried to the right wing, where he saw his men were hard-pressed, standards of the 12th, clustered in one place, the soldiers so crowded together that it impeded their fighting. All the centurions in the 4th cohort had fallen, the signifer was dead and his standard captured. In the remaining cohorts, every centurion was either dead or wounded, including the primus pilus, Sextus Julius Baculus, an exceptionally brave man, who was exhausted by his many serious wounds and could no longer stand. The other soldiers were tired, and some in the rear, giving up the fight, withdrawing out of missile range. The enemy were edging closer up the slope in front and pressing hard on both flanks. He saw that the situation was critical, there was no other reserve available, took a shield from a man in the rear ranks, he'd come without his own, advanced into the front line and called on the centurions by name, encouraged the soldiers, ordered the line to advance, the units to extend, so that they could employ their swords more easily. His arrival brought hope to the soldiers, refreshed their spirits, every man wanting to do his best in sight of his general, even in such a desperate situation. The enemy's advance was delayed for a while. So here you've got a situation where Caesar has been, first of all, rushed into getting everything ready, starting to form his army up, prepare them for battle, because he's been surprised, humbugged by God, that sort of sense. He didn't expect a battle on this day in this place, but it's happened, so how do you react? And some of this is the routine, that the army will know what to do when it's required of them, but the general is also rushing around trying to make sure that things happen. Again, a very familiar thing. There are the routines, there are the drills, but it never does any harm having people trying to make sure everything happens quickly. And that the battle line does join up, that there aren't big gaps. After a while, he realizes that his right wing is in trouble, where the 12th Legion is, and they wouldn't necessarily have been in that position in a normal battle line had the army been set up. They basically deployed as they came from where they were preparing to encamp. So this isn't the full deployment, because normally 10th Legion tends to be on the right. Gallops over there. Again, the mobility of being on horseback combined with the advantage of that little bit of extra height being on horseback is obvious, but nevertheless it reinforces the advantage of being mounted for a lot of periods of history where you're fighting with armies where you have mass formations. It allows you to get around more, to see more. Different means of mobility and communication now, but it's the same basic principles. So he sees there's a crisis, goes to the crisis point. When he gets closer, he can see how bad things were. Got a cohort where all the centurions are down, the signifer's dead, primus pilus of the legion is down, men are drifting to the rear. He gets a sense of how it's going. Groups are clustered together, they're not fighting effectively. They're under immense pressure. He goes to the front rank, grabbing a shield from a man in the rear ranks because he doesn't have his own, not fully prepared. Implication he'd normally have one, probably not the full scutum, but something, or have an attendant who would provide him with it when needed. Pushes to the front rank. So here we've gone from the general who was right at the back, to the general intervening, galloping around as normal, to the general pushing to the front rank, at which point his perspective changes. He can no longer see the big picture. The rest of the battle, Caesar doesn't claim to do anything else other than with the legion, the troops immediately around him. And what he does there is not, again, I emphasized in the talk on Caesar as a general, he doesn't tell us about fighting anybody. And it's very clear from the description that the fighting is not constant. This is, the Gauls are coming forward, they're lobbing missiles, that's making people retreat out of range of those missiles. But there's not a constant two lines smacked together fighting hand to hand, let alone loads of individuals interwoven and everybody fighting individual duels a la Hollywood. There are presumably surges forward by the Gauls, and the Romans are giving way. There's a threat that the Roman line will collapse altogether, in which case the Gauls will come after them, or the Belgians. But he is able to do that. Once he's there, he encourages them. Interestingly, centurions by name, again emphasizing their higher status and the fact that there are 60 centurions in a legion compared to, in theory, 5,000 men, probably 3,000 to 4,000 by the time, because they've been on campaign for a while, but who knows, something like that. So it's you can know and you can remember the names, or at least something about 60 men fairly easily, or even the number of legions you've got, the few hundred centurions plus tribunes and things. It's within the number that you can recognize, you can manage, in the same way that the commander of a battalion of, say, 800, or the headmaster or headmistress of a school of 800, 900, can probably just about identify as individuals all the pupils within that school, all the men within the battalion. Even if they don't necessarily remember the name of all of them or all the details about them, so once you get beyond 1,000 or so, it seems to be humanly difficult, probably impossible to do that. It's one of those ways that units have been structured throughout history. Anyway, that's an aside, one of my many digressions. Caesar encourages the centurions by name, the men individually, and he gives orders, changes the formation, again that they're able to do that, suggests they're not in immediate contact, but the enemy are close and threatening, but there's space to do that. And everybody in under sight of his general, in such a desperate situation, everyone wants to do his best. The enemy's advance was delayed for a while. Caesar doesn't claim to have won the battle by this intervention. What he claims is that he stops the battle from being lost, and then Labienus and other units elsewhere win the battle for him, because they succeed on their positions and they realize what's happening. They send troops back to help the beleaguered right wing. That emphasis on encouragement is very strong in a lot of sources. Now, Josephus is fairly sycophantic towards Titus, but it's nevertheless within what was thought normal in the Roman world, what at least the aristocrats thought that their role was. So at Siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, you get for praise of Titus for his ability to intervene. Thus, if, without a syllable of added in flattery or withheld in envy, the truth must be told, Caesar, that's Titus, personally twice rescued the entire legion when in jeopardy, enabled them to entrench themselves in their camp unmolested. There's been a surprise attack. Titus has led his singulares, his cavalry bodyguard, and other units to rush to the threatened sector. Very much like Caesar at the Sombra. Spotted something that's going on, rushed to the area, led reserves in person, and relieved the pressure, stopped the breakthrough. Now, later on, he says, with the Romans, on the other hand, he's contrasting them with the defenders and their motivations, the incentives to valor were their habit of victory and inexperience of defeat, their continuous campaigns and perpetual training, the magnitude of their empire, and above all Titus, ever and everywhere present beside all. For cowardice when Caesar was with them and sharing the contest seemed monstrous, while the man who fought bravely had as witness of his valor one who would also reward it. No, it was gain already to be known to Caesar as courageous. Hence many in their enthusiasm displayed greater valor than their strength warranted. This is a warning actually where people are doing more than they should and getting killed. At the end of the Siege of Jerusalem, Josephus describes the grand parade that Titus held. His officers and the commander stand on a platform facing the army. Titus gave orders to the appointed officers to read out the names of all who had performed any brilliant feat during the war. Calling each up by name, he applauded them as they came forward, no less exultant over their exploits than if they were his own. He then placed crowns of gold upon their heads, presented them with golden neck chains, little golden spears, and standards made of silver, and promoted each man to a higher rank. He further assigned to them out of the spoils silver and gold and raiments and other booty in abundance. When all had been rewarded as he judged each to have deserved, after invoking blessings on the whole army, he descended amidst many acclamations and proceeded to offer sacrifices of thanksgiving for his victory. A vast number of oxen being brought up beside the altars, he sacrificed them all and distributed them to the troops for a banquet. This is mirrored by Polybius' description in the 2nd century BC of the rewards after a battle, after a campaign by Roman commanders, and this emphasis on incentives to be brave, to be honoured by the entire community, with rewards in promotion, but also in decorations which would be worn, particularly in those days when citizens went back at any festival. So the fellow citizens would know that. So there's a big belief in all our sources that soldiers would be encouraged by the presence of a commander. There's one anecdote that claims that a commander under Domitian actually had men write or paint their names on their shields so that they'd be recognized, or they would feel that they would be recognized, because you'd assume the shield would be pointed towards the enemy and away from the general. But it made you feel. It's a bit like, I suppose, the element of, it's also easier for him to ride up and say, oh, hello, Fulvius, because there it is painted on the shield, and encourage them, like name tags on uniforms today. The general can reward, the general can also punish, because that's the other side of the coin, that if you do badly and you're known to the general will be angry. You can have all sorts of formal or symbolic punishments, up to decimation in certain circumstances, but more individual punishment with disgrace, drop in rank, humiliating. Augustus has centurions stand outside his tent without their belts, so their tunic hangs long like a woman's dress, and holding a clod of earth or something, a clod of turf, out, this sort of thing, or something else to show everybody that they've messed up and not to do it again. It's best to do your job properly. It's also, bear in mind, this is a system where patronage dominates careers, and this is how you get promotion. So to draw the attention, it's like Josephus is saying, just to be recognized as an individual. If Titus notices you, knows your name, then there's a good chance good things will happen to you. Certainly a better chance than you had before when you were just an anonymous soldier. So they want people to stand out. This isn't all about just the unit doing things. They need the leaders, they need the bold men, they need the ones who will go first, the ones who will take charge when there's a crisis and nobody else is doing it. So best way for men without the formal patronage of having family connections to get promotion is to be spotted by a commander and then rewarded. And the system does rely on the commanders doing this often enough for people to believe it's worthwhile. So you have that encouragement, that incentive. You also have the command role. You judge the situation. You commit reserves, either by messengers, either by sending an officer, right, you go there, take that cohort, reinforce that sector, or you go yourself and do it. You could reinforce the fighting line with these fresh units to get impetus going forward, exploit a success, plug a gap, prevent collapse. That gives the Roman army a lot of endurance in battle. We'll come back to this when we look in more detail at combat and its nature. And shove the enemy off balance before that. But the general's not tied to one sector. He can move around the line and try and, again, it's anticipate the hour and the outcome. In the Onosander thing, you've got to try and work out where you should be. Where's the critical point going to be? The Schwerpunkt, whatever it might be. Where's the crisis going to happen? Where's the opportunity going to develop? And how do I exploit those or stop them? So in theory, he's supposed to be in the right place every time, anticipate this, which demands considerable ability. All of this, the big thing to emphasize is that this actually gives the general a lot of power. The old idea, that view, it's the centurions, the professionals, you point them in the direction of the enemy, and then like a sort of clockwork machine, they just churn their way forward. And it's the centurions, this was the old rather crazy view, that decided if they're in a reserve, if they're in the second or third line, when to go and commit themselves, when to join in, when to lead their men forward. That is not the picture presented by the sources, apart from not making a lot of sense, because how could you be expected from that perspective to know what's going on? You do occasionally get units taken from a reserve part of the line and moved to a different sector of the line altogether. So this is a system, the basic setup, the emphasis on reserves, the emphasis on the general moving around, intervening, both to inspire but also to command control. An awful lot of responsibility was concentrated in the hands of the general. This is a hierarchy with the general on the top. So the idea that it is this machine that basically has made him irrelevant because the Roman army simply follows drills is based around very questionable assumptions and some of the crazier ideas that suggested, 18th century warfare under Frederick the Great and the like produced a sort of clockwork automata as soldiers. That again, there's recent studies suggesting that isn't even true for that period, but it's a different thing. That's not the way ancient battles work. That's not the way the Roman army worked. The leaders are really, really important. The commanders are really important. And most of all, the man who can do the most for good or ill is the one in charge of the army. So what are the other officers doing? We've got our general moving around, trying to be in the right place at the right time. Unlike the general, subordinate commanders will be tied to a particular section of the line. Now, often that's the unit you command, so the legionary legate will command that. There are some hints from Arrian's account of a battle order he was going to use against the Alans in Cappadocia in the 2nd century, where he has actually divided up sectors of the line and put somebody in charge of each one. So auxiliary units, it comes back to this ad hoc brigading together of units, so that there is somebody responsible for each section of the line. The bigger the army is, the more important, obviously, that gets. In Caesar's case, he seems to appoint a legatus to each legion, and they control that sector of the line. And then you've got the unit commanders, legionary centurions. Presumably there is one in charge of a cohort. This is never specifically stated, but just seems to be the logical thing, because cohorts certainly act as a tactical unit, and it's very hard to see how you could do that without somebody being in charge. So again, it comes back to this: centurion is a grade of officer, not a rank. One of them, they presumably know who is in charge, who is the most senior present with the cohort, and therefore is in charge. Same with an auxiliary prefect or tribune in charge of a cohort or an ala. The cavalry detachments of cohortes equitatae, the mixed infantry cavalry units, they seem to be detached in battle by Arrian, grouped together in ad hoc units with a commander. So again, it's this idea that there'll be somebody in charge to tell you what to do, or at least try to tell you what to do and control what's happening. There's a great emphasis on keeping order, keeping in formation, again emphasized in Arrian. They're doing what the commander's doing, just at a different scale. So there's an emphasis on inspirational behavior. It doesn't always work. You have a chap called Decrius commanding a cohort in North Africa in the early part of the 1st century AD under the Emperor Tiberius, who leads a charge against the Numidian army that's come to attack his outpost, leads the men out and charges them. He charges forward, gallops towards the enemy, but his men don't follow him, or very few of them do, and he gets himself killed. The cohort will subsequently be punished, decimated. Not clear whether these are legionaries or auxiliaries, so whether he's a legionary centurion or an auxiliary prefect. But it's the cohorts, as I say, decimated. This is seen as a particularly bad behavior. However, Caesar emphasizes very strongly how his centurions lead aggressively, lead from the front, go first, and suffer a disproportionately high casualty rate as a result. Crassinus, the man who leads the attack at Pharsalus, dies with a sword through the mouth. But his men have made the first breakthrough in the enemy line. They are very much emphasized. The centurions in Caesar, and to an extent elsewhere as well, we never quite get the detail we have in Caesar anywhere else. These are the men that lead you forward. They are expected to do this. They are expected to take risks. So that inspirational value of, they say, come on, not go on, means, as I say, that they are more at risk, and a lot of them do tend to die. But nevertheless, they also lead their men forward and inspire them to go forward with that basic thing. Like any of these heroic gestures, if you get away with it, then everybody might follow, the attack might succeed. If you get killed quickly, then it might all collapse fairly soon as well. But there are others that come forward to lead in those situations as well. They're also commanding in terms of what the unit should do at a different level, with more restrictions. They're part of the broader army formation. So quite how much flexibility they have, but elements of when you're going to throw pilo, when you're going to charge, this sort of thing will probably be there. There's also the carrot and the stick here, as there is with inspiration and punishment. The Optio, as his badge of rank, had a hastile, a spear shaft, but with an ornate top, a sort of decorative thing on the top of it that isn't really a weapon. Now, there are hints that they also stand behind the formation. So it's a little bit like the file closers of an 18th, 19th century formed unit, where a lot of your NCOs in particular would stand behind the main formation to keep the men in their ranks. And that 18th century, early 19th century habit of carrying halberds, spontoons, these not particularly useful weapons and melee weapons, not a firearm, but allowed you to push men back into the ranks. So you get descriptions of this. Again, we'll come on to this another day and we look in more detail at this. So you have people to push the men on, as well as some to lead them on. That's the combination. Now, a lot of the Roman army's success clearly comes down to high standards of leadership. It's all very well talking about discipline and training and all this sort of thing, but unless people on the spot actually encourage you to do the best, to live up to this, and make good decisions as well tactically, but also keep you there and keep you fighting, then the odds are the army's going to break, the army's going to fail. The army's not going to succeed in its attacks. It's going to bog down. So they play a heavy role and they play a price. It's risky for the commanders moving around the fighting line. They're not fighting in the front rank like an Alexander, but they're nevertheless vulnerable to missiles and to the occasional head case of an enemy who wants to make a name for himself, charging through the fairly open fighting line to get to them. Again, we'll talk about all this more when we talk about, well, we'll look at Roman generals in battle in great detail sometime, and we'll look more generally at commanders in the ancient world and what they do sometime as well. It's aggressive at all levels. You are encouraged to go forward. Yes, aggressive with discipline isn't just wild. You don't just steam towards the enemy, but you take all the best preparations, you get yourself into the best position, the best formation, the best situation. But once you've done that and once the moment is right, you go for the enemy and you keep on going for him and you don't stop. So there is an emphasis. And again, remember, this is combat. It's being decided by at least the threat of hand-to-hand combat, but often the reality of it, by charging right up face-to-face with the enemy and fighting him hand-to-hand. And that, judging from other periods of history, has always been very difficult. In more recent periods, troops more often than not broke before a bayonet charge, and bayonet fighting was very, very rare outside built-up areas, fortifications, this sort of thing, because one side or the other flinched at the last minute. Again, we'll come on to this when we look at combat more generally. So generals get hit by missiles. They get attacked by individual enemies. Centurions tend to get killed at a higher rate than everyone else. You could look at the figures for Pharsalus, for Gergovia with Caesar's legions, and again, the centurions really suffer. Usually you're talking twice as likely to be killed than a man in the ranks, sometimes even more so. And when things go badly, it's often, think of Caesar's singling out all the centurions in that cohort are down. The Primus Pilus is fainting from his wounds, this sort of thing. A significant proportion, it's a minority, but Roman generals do get hurt, they do get killed. Vespasian gets wounded in the foot, fighting in a built-up area. Titus has missiles near him. Trajan gets a man shot by an arrow next to him. Some of Caesar's commanders do fall, others get wounded. It is dangerous, it is risky. It's not the risks of an Alexander or a Philip, but nevertheless, you are not miles away, sending telegrams or dispatch riders. It's more the Duke of Wellington approach to warfare than, say, Napoleon, particularly in his later years, where he's got used to bigger armies and he wants to be the controlling mind behind it all rather than the inspirational leader. But it's very much the Wellington moving around. I mean, Waterloo is perhaps exceptional for that, as we talked about in the video on that. But bear in mind that he's left with hardly any staff officers at the end of the battle because they're either off doing things or they're dead or they're wounded. And it's, the hand of God was on me. He's amazed that he survived. How could he go through all of that? Now, obviously, the greater firepower of musketry, artillery, and something makes that situation even more dangerous. But the ancient world is not without its risks. And depending on the enemy you're facing, those risks can be particularly high. Publius Crassus, the son of Crassus, in the fighting at Carrhae, he gets badly wounded by a missile before the Four Seas with collapses. So again, even if you're dressed in the uniform of an ordinary soldier and you're doing that thing, by your behavior, by the way you're riding around, by the conspicuous group of officers around you, it's going to be obvious who the general is, and he'll have his standard close by him as well. So he is a target for missiles and for attacks. So that's what we come back to. That's hopefully given us a sense in double the time that I planned, and I'm afraid I've failed in the challenge I set myself once again. I was rambling on. The problem is with the Roman army, there's so many things where if you say something, this is how it was, really that requires so many qualifications, and it's hard for me not to give those. But anyway, hopefully this has been of interest. Hopefully it's given some slightly different ways of thinking about how any army, in this case particularly the Roman army, works, how its command structure, how its leaders operate, what they're expected to do, and their importance in the overall results. So anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.